You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here, with my second attempt to record this. The first time, I was just too sick. Now, there's a thunderstorm, so who knows what'll happen. Anyway, today we're taking a look at a podcast from the Institute for Creation Research, or ICR. Despite historically being one of the big names in young Earth creationism, the ICR has been waning in terms of influence for decades, now being outshadowed by the likes of Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International. Interestingly, they recently changed their logo twice. And this video is from that brief period between logo changes when they had the DNA helix the wrong way. They have since fixed it. This video was sent to me by Paleo101, who also has a response to it, which is linked in the description. Paleo101 is a cool guy, so go check him out on YouTube. Anyway, we're going to be talked to about what it is we can really learn from fossils, according to ICR, by some guy and Dr. Timothy Clary.
I'm your host, Trey, and my guest today is ICR research scientist and geologist, Dr. Timothy Clary. It's a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Clary.
It's great being here.
Yeah. Today, we're going to talk about fossils. More specifically, the fossil record, not the individuals themselves. For our viewers and listeners, and maybe me, I could use a refresher. What is the fossil record?
Basically, it's just the collection of all fossils that we have discovered. That's why if someone says there is no evidence of bunnies in the Cambrian, they mean currently in known Cambrian fossils.
Well, the fossil record is just the collection of all fossils ever discovered. And so it's whatever's been found, they kind of lump it all together in that big term, the fossil record. It's like it's a big book, but it's, a record that you play. Now you youngsters know what records are.
Right.
Back in my day, we had these big LPs. Now you guys are buying them again.
Yeah, they're coming back in style.
It's really just, whatever's been discovered around the world as a fossil. We're always adding to the fossil record. We're always finding new discoveries.
Well, it's nice that we agree on this at least.
And so it's just a collection of all the fossils.
So it's a conglomeration term of everything that's there. All right. That's easy enough. Now, I've heard a number of scientists say that the order in which the fossils are found in this fossil record, that's indicative of, the evolutionary sequence.
It is very indicative of the evolutionary sequence. So much so that nowadays, paleontology usually proceeds by paleontologists using evolutionary theory to predict where to dig to find things of particular interest. Most famously was Neil Shubin's find of Tiktaalik, where he was looking explicitly for a basal stem tetrapod in rocks that he had picked because of his predictions from evolutionary theory. Then he found just such a thing. If the fossil record were not indicative of an evolutionary sequence, such a thing could only happen by chance. And yet it keeps happening. The whole reason people went to Africa looking for potential human ancestors is that that's where evolution predicted we would find them. And then, lo and behold, that's where they were found.
Now, as creationists, we don't hold to that idea. But can you talk about that? Are there problems with that?
Well, that's what we're taught in school when I took my geology classes. If you take a geology class or if you're in an earth science class in high school or you take a geology class in college, that's what you're going to be told, is that the fossils show evidence of evolution, but they really don't.
Okay, so here's a look at some phytoplankton through what science has determined to be millions of years. Sure looks like evolution, and of course, because I know how much y'all love it, here's the transitional species slideshow.
The fossils show sudden appearances, and it's in a term called stasis, which means they stay the same, and then they disappear.
In some cases, sure, but then let's take a look at some of my favorite aquatic animals. Here we have cetaceans, whales, dolphins, and porpoises. The earliest such animals look like pretty basal artiodactyls. And then we get some great transitional forms until we get to the animals that are basically the modern whales. And here there are 3 species of the genus Thalassocnus, which are almost certainly what is termed a series of chronospecies. This means that all 3 species are not separate populations, but the same population at different times. So while in general we get only very few transitional forms between closely related species, we do get some, and at higher levels of taxonomy, we actually get a lot of transitions. Dr. Clary can only make this claim by cherry picking.
Or extinction. So you see fossils showing up in the fossil record at different levels, and then you see them stay the same for a while, and then they disappear. And some of them, start just very limited range. Others have a little longer range. Others, are still alive today. We still see fossils of the same things that are supposed to be, millions of years old, and they're exactly the same today. And that's a bit of a problem for the evolutionists as well, because why wouldn't everything be constantly evolving and changing? Why do we see things that theoretically in their world 500 million years old or 400 million years old, and yet they're still alive today?
Well, first I would like a citation about the same animals being alive today. All the so-called living fossils that exist today are in fact distinct from their fossil relatives, just not as distinct as we're used to in most lineages. And for how organisms can stay relatively the same in terms of gross morphology, well, let me introduce you to stabilizing selection. If an organism is well adapted to its niche and the environment it lives in is fairly stable, then it has already reached a very stable and high level of fitness, such that significant deviation from this morphology is likely to lead to a decrease in fitness. So natural selection acts to keep the morphology more or less the same. So in fact, evolution predicts that some very well adapted lineages will not change significantly in ways that will show up in fossils.
Yeah.
And so some of these things are a little bit odd. It doesn't really fit the story that they're selling to everybody, but unfortunately they have the microphone, literally, and so they can tell people what they want.
Except it actually fits quite well, and I suspect that Dr. Clary knows this.
But to me, the fossil record shows sudden appearance, stasis, it's called, staying the same, and then disappearance. And that reflects the global flood.
Okay.
Cool. So then does he have evidence that the fossil-bearing strata, which remember ICR says is basically all of them, Cenozoic included, are flood rocks? And not what they evidently are, which is combinations of all sorts of different rocks from all sorts of environments? No, he doesn't, or he'd have presented it in a real scientific journal, and there would be real debate. Does he have any evidence of hydrologic sorting of fossils, such that there's a bias for streamlined, dense fossils towards the bottom of the geological column, and lighter, less streamlined ones at the top? Still no.
Well, at this point in time, you do have a microphone, so now's the time to use it.
That's right.
That's great.
Well, this was uploaded to YouTube on July 26, 2022. At the time of this writing, it had 965 views. So I'm not sure who that microphone is reaching. Those are bad numbers, especially for an organization that considers itself at the forefront of creationist research. By the way, the name of the show is What Can We Learn from Fossils? The Creation Podcast, episode 28.
So you mentioned this briefly. You mentioned the flood. So my next question is, where did all these fossils come from, and why are they in the order they're in? How did they get there?
If you read the literature, you're listening to the stories that are being taught by the evolutionary scientists, they'll tell you we evolved from, marine animals. But that's what we see being buried first in the flood. My research has been showing that as the flood progressed, it didn't flood everything right away. It took 150 days, the Bible says, to get to the high point. So as it progressed along, initially what it flooded was these shallow marine areas, which were pretty extensive in the pre-flood world, it looks like.
So we should only find shallow marine depositions from the Cambrian then, because the Cambrian is what Dr. Clary would call the flood covering the shallow marine areas. Then what are we to do with the lower Cambrian Nexø sandstone formation of Bornholm, Denmark? It is a fluvial deposit with aeolian sheets of sandstone mixed in. That's certainly not a shallow marine environment. And the thing is, that was the first thing that popped up when I searched Aeolian Sandstone Cambrian on Google Scholar. This evidence isn't hiding, nor is it new. The aeolian nature of some of the bedding in this formation has been well known for about 60 years now.
And so you're going to naturally get marine fossils first. And as you work your way up, eventually you start flooding the land, you start getting land animals. So we didn't evolve and crawl out of the sea. It's just a bad story that has no basis for it, because what we see in the fossils is they stay the same.
Ah, yes. So let's look at the emergence of tetrapods then. Because, things like Euthenopteron, Pendrichthyes, Tiktaalik, Ichthyostega, and Acanthostega are all just identical, and don't in fact come at different times in the fossil record and show a clear morphological shift from basal sarcopterygian fish to basal tetrapods. It's almost like Dr. Clary is lying to us.
And then you suddenly see something else above them, and you see something else above that. And so it's really just a record of the water, what we call ecological zones, ecological zonation.
Oh, okay. So there shouldn't be any, say, Eocene marine deposits, because by this time we're getting into the highlands. Funny then how Basilosaurus, a big Eocene whale, is found in Eocene marine rock. Why isn't it in the Cambrian or even the Ediacaran when the flood is inundating those areas? Did Basilosaurus run uphill to avoid the tsunamis crashing down all around it? That hardly seems plausible.
As you go through these different environments, starting with the marine, and eventually you get to the coastal areas, and you get to higher areas and higher ground areas.
But we already know that's just not how it works. We get terrestrial and marine environments from every level of the geological column.
The land animals change, the plants change because you're going higher and higher in elevation. So it's really just the order of burial in the flood.
Fascinating. And that totally makes sense as to why, like, I forget the exact number, but like 95% of fossils are marine fossils, right?
That number was made up one day by Dwayne Gish of the ICR in an offhand talk where he was estimating. I know of no study that has estimated such a thing, since there would be no scientific value to it. And given that things like chalk are essentially just solid fossil, I'd be surprised if the percentage was as low as 95% if we take each individual skeleton that went to make up the chalk as a single fossil. But then, what's the point? Most deposition occurs in water, so of course most fossils are of aquatic organisms.
Right,
Like
and even T-Rexes found in Montana are found mixed with sharks. There's 6 different species of sharks in the Hell Creek Formation where they found Tyrannosaurus rex sioux and most of our T-Rexes.
How is that something that helps? Shouldn't those sharks have been buried down with the trilobites and the anomalocarids? Oh, the fossil record is sorted by ecological zone, except when it's not. The fact is, the Hell Creek Formation, which according to Clary here, was deposited basically midway through the flood, was a swampy forest area bordered by the Western Interior Seaway. So what was this doing in the middle of the flood when presumably the floodwaters should have been at least racing through the uplands of the world? Well, I feel like we're never going to get an answer to that. Also, it looks like we're up to 7 sharks as of the time of this writing. We have Kilocilium, Galagadon, Lonchidian, Miadaphis, Protogingliumostota, Rustecia, and a so far unassigned tooth of a carcharinid. The last one is a member of the same family as the lemon shark, blacktip reef shark, and the blue shark.
And lots of other marine fossils as well. And we even find dinosaurs in marine rocks.
Yes, dead animals can wash out to sea. This isn't news.
And the research, as I go around from continent to continent, I see this pattern everywhere. Europe, almost all their Cretaceous fossils are found in marine rocks. They're found in limestones and chalk.
Yes, dead animals can wash out to sea. This isn't news.
And so the secular story has to be, well, they got washed out to sea. But animals that wash out to sea, they don't survive.
Oh, animals washed out to sea might not survive.
I am aware.
Well, yeah, since these are fossils we're talking about, that seems obvious.
Right.
They get eaten.
Scavenged.
They get scavenged, and then they decay away. What's left of them?
Interesting. What happens if they fall into an anoxic lagoon, like the ones that created the Solnhofen Lagerstätten in Germany? What's going to scavenge them since there's basically no oxygen? Oh, is it nothing? To take Dr. Clary seriously, we would have to assume that basically all taphonomists have never, ever considered scavenging. Well, since Google Scholar returns more than 18,000 results for scavenge marks on fossils, it seems that's just not the case. Turns out scientists have already accounted for this and not infrequently report scavenge marks on the fossils they find. This is also one of the reasons that fossils are usually disarticulated. They were literally torn apart by scavengers.
And so we even found one dinosaur washed out to sea off Norway, 70 miles offshore.
Closer to 250 miles offshore, but what's an order of magnitude between friends, right?
And they drilled an oil well in the North Sea, 1.5 miles down. They pulled up a core, which is just a few inches around. And in it, they had a dinosaur bone that they could identify.
Identify as a dinosaur? Yes. Identify which dinosaur? No. But let's take a look at this. Because me being me, I not only found the paper, I linked it. It's in the description. So this is a small fragment of long bone basically in cross-section. You see a ring of bone, and you can clearly see the inner medullary cavity that in life would have housed marrow. But was this animal 250 miles out to sea when it died? Well, no. And how do we know? Well, the rock it's in contains things like roots, terrestrial pollen, and paleosols, all of which puts this deposition, which is late Triassic, probably by the Radian stage, although it's a bit iffy, and in a fluvial environment. The sediment was brought to the location by rivers, and turned into soil in which plants grew, all above water. And the thing is, this is in the initial paper describing the find. Dr. Clary either only looked at pop-sci outlets, or he's just lying about the paper. This was not a dinosaur that was washed out to sea. This place just wasn't sea when the dinosaur died.
The actual species of dinosaur, a Plateosaurus.
First, that's not a species. That's a genus. Second, no, it was not assigned to Plateosaurus. It was noted that it was consistent with such an assignment. That's not the same thing, and Dr. Clary should know that. I'm not saying it wasn't Plateosaurus. It's entirely plausible that it was, but I also can't say with any certainty that it was in fact of that genus.
70 miles offshore. So these waves were coming in, not only burying things and mixing marine fossils with the land animals, they're also washing some of the land animals, probably many of them, back out.
Except the rock isn't marine. It was entirely terrestrial.
Just out to sea, just like you'd expect to see. We see this with the tsunami waves. They come in
Right.
and they go back out. And unfortunately, people are killed because tsunamis, are very, very deadly and very, very fast. And that's kind of what we think the flood was like, these huge tsunami waves that kept coming in and burying things.
Dr. Clary brings up a really good point. People do tragically die in tsunamis. Now, this is because people live on the coast, because coasts are resource-rich and water travel is often more efficient than traveling over land. However, since tsunamis are faster than people, they generally can't escape them. So if the flood caused multiple tsunamis, why aren't there human remains in these layers along with these supposedly coastal dinosaurs? Before the flood, did people just not like the ocean?
And that's what kind of created the fossil record. So there's an order to the fossil record, but it's the order of burial in the flood. And we see that matched up, continent to continent. We see the same pattern.
Right. That's why whales are always much, much higher than the desert dwellers like Scutosaurus. Makes total sense.
Everywhere I look, the same story is there. So there is kind of a true geologic column, a global column that's not complete in many places because different waves came in at different times, but that's what gave us the fossil record.
At least we're a step up from Kent Hovind.
And the waves also allow for some mixing of those fossils.
Right. And
as
some
well.
of those waves, as they transport back, of course, you're going to destroy environments, and then suddenly you're going to have completely different animals above it. And that's going to look like what secular scientists or evolutionists call extinctions. So they have about 5 major extinctions through the rock record.
Okay, but tsunami depositions are identifiable as such. And also within these supposed tsunami deposits, we have whole ranges of ecosystems, including marine, coastal, terrestrial, desert, forest, swamp, etc. In fact, some places alternate between marine and terrestrial a few times. How does this square with ecological zonation going inland and up in elevation? How can every environment type be caught up in one tsunami, all washed into a big deposit, then the next tsunami captures the exact same set of environments, but in different places, with a largely different assemblage of flora and fauna? This just doesn't pass the first bit of scrutiny. Were Permian deserts always lower than Jurassic deserts, which were always lower than Eocene deserts? Then, despite this, they end up on top of each other anyway? And curiously, all with rocks that look like the rocks being deposited in deserts today, rather than looking like tsunami deposits? How does any of this work?
Where they think, something happened, like an asteroid hit, or some other story they have to come up with to explain why suddenly things change dramatically and many animals disappear. But really what that shows is that these environments are now completely inundated globally. So the entire ecosystem at that level is now gone as the water went higher and higher. And now you have a completely different ecosystem above it.
Except, like we've said, it's not always a completely different ecosystem. We get shallow coasts in all stages, yet the living things in them change dramatically. What do we have? Shallow marine coasts up on mountains to explain this?
Yeah.
And you occasionally get one or two of the same animals, but that's where the dinosaurs disappear. The extinction of the dinosaurs is supposed to be from an asteroid, but the research I did collecting my columns and oil well data across Mexico where this is supposed to hit, the Yucatan area, to me, there's not enough melt in the rocks to be a big asteroid, and there's not even enough what they call iridium, which is this rare earth element that's supposed to come out of, when asteroids hit, they send a dust cloud of iridium out.
Okay, this is just completely wrong. The iridium layer at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary is quite noticeable around the world, and is missing in very few places, because those areas were undergoing erosion or later eroded. This is hugely higher in concentration than other sources of relatively high iridium, such as volcanic eruptions. The impact area is full of melted and shocked material like breccia and shock quartz, and it's associated with tektites, previously melted bits of ejecta from the impact. Of course, there is also the fact that the crater is right there.
But there's not much iridium there. Only 2, I think, out of the 10 or 12 wells show any iridium. So
Weird then how a quick search for Cretaceous iridium on Google Scholar brings up reports of significantly elevated iridium levels in places such as Antarctica, New Mexico, Saskatchewan, Gubbio, Italy, New Zealand, South France, Alberta, Denmark, Southeast Poland, Siberia, Seymour Island, the Spanish Pyrenees, and more. That Clary failed to find it in some of the samples he took isn't really a counter to the literally thousands of reports of iridium at the KPG boundary from others.
To me, I don't know if there really was much of an asteroid impact there.
Then either he didn't look into it, or he's lying about having done so. Or he knows better because he has looked into it, and then he's lying about the evidence not being conclusive. For fuck's sake, there's a crater right there.
Just seems kind of like a story.
But that's the stories they have. They have to tell these stories because they have no way to explain them.
Yep, we got a mass extinction, ejecta, extensive melting, worldwide iridium anomalies, and recently even a kill site directly caused by the impact. Gee, I wonder what kind of crazy story could explain literally everything an asteroid impact might cause. I don't know, probably a flood, right? Floods melt the crust of the Earth and leave massive craters, don't they? Also, what about those fish who were actually hit by meteor ejecta found by Robert De Palma, Jan Smit, David Burnham, and Walter Alvarez in South Dakota? That's probably fake, right?
Wow.
And even some of the paleontologists don't believe that story. Some of them say, well, how did the frogs survive? Because they have frog fossils that go right across that boundary.
Yeah, the mystery of the frogs, while not fake, doesn't exactly overturn the existence of ejecta and the actual damn crater. Like, the crater is there. We know there was an impact. We know it caused an iridium layer. We know it spewed ejecta half a planet away. This was not a minor event.
And, frogs should have been affected by all this acid rain and all these other effects of a major asteroid impact.
Whoever said that frogs were unaffected, they actually increased in diversity afterwards. Exactly why this is, I'm honestly not sure, and that's okay.
But they weren't. And so, they still push this asteroid. Many kids will come to ICR's Discovery Center and they'll talk about, the asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs. I'm like, no, not really. That's, the flood buried a lot of them, but the dinosaurs didn't go extinct until after the flood.
Right.
Because they got off the ark. Like all the other animals that got on the ark, they eventually went extinct in the last probably century or 1,000 years, a couple thousand years. Not the last century, the last 500 to 1,000 years.
Honestly, at this point, I had kind of forgotten that in addition to denying the overwhelming evidence, Dr. Clary is advocating for the entirely unevidenced idea that the non-avian dinosaurs stepped off a big boat on the top of a mountain in Turkey and then went extinct at only some point in the Common Era.
Fascinating. So actually that brings me to another point. We had talked in a previous episode about the flood year and about those sequences. It's interesting that not only are the sequences in the rock, they're in the fossils as well as they were buried by the flood. So we've heard of the term missing link before and all of that.
An unfortunate term. Really, we should be using the phrase transitional form rather than missing link.
And I don't want to dive too deep into this, but let's just talk about it a little bit. What about transitional fossils?
Right. The transitional fossils are supposed to be those, fossils where one animal's slowly turning into another. And that was Darwin's original idea. And he said there should be millions of transitional fossils all over. At his, 1859, he said, well, we just haven't found enough fossils yet to we'll fill those pieces in, but we never have. 160 years later, we still haven't found any indisputable transitional fossil. There's a few that they pull out and say, well, this is kind of a transitional one, but then more people study it and they realize it's really not. And so even the evolutionary or the secular community disagrees on, the few that they have, you can count them pretty much on two hands that they try to point to occasionally, but even those are all disputed. So there really aren't. You'd expect to see, if evolution is true, animals of all types just slowly changing.
Everything is disputable. That doesn't mean that they're not transitional. And I think we've seen enough of them to show that this point is silly.
We see a lot of variation.
Right.
There's
see that today.
It was over 1,000 dinosaurs named, but there's really only about 60 kinds. There's.
Oh, and I'm sure that Dr. Clary is going to tell us what a kind is and how he knows if organisms are not in the same kind.
There's just a lot of variety. Just like you and I look different, most humans look different. Even if you're a twin, you generally there's something that you can tell, look a little bit different. So just like, most of God's created animal world, there's variation and variety everywhere. And so we see all these fossils, and they name them all new species because they're slightly different.
Oh, so the morphospecies concept has edge cases and problems with definitions like all other species concepts. Whatever shall we do? Hey, fun fact, that doesn't really matter, because fundamentally, species are a human concept. What aren't are clades. That is the group of organisms all descended from a single common ancestor population. And guess what? If kinds existed, They would be clades. So who cares what problems we have with the human concepts? Let's talk about the actual cladistics. So what cladistic analysis recovered 60 distinct unrelated kinds of dinosaurs? Oh, it was none? Because when you do a cladistic analysis of dinosaurs, it turns out that there's just as much reason to think they're all related as there is to think that, say, Velociraptor and Utahraptor are related?
And so if you were to find, poodles and St. Bernards and any dog breed, which are all the same species,
Right.
any dog breed, if you found their bones, they would all be called different species because they look quite different from one another, but yet they have the same general shape.
Yeah, I thought so. Yes, dogs are a uniquely and artificially morphologically diverse subspecies of Canis lupus. But do we have any examples of non-domesticated species which fit other definitions of a species, such as the biological species concept with a similarly broad range of morphological diversities? Well, in fact, no, we don't. So unless Dr. Clary wants to show evidence for selective breeding of dinosaurs, this is a bad comparison.
Yeah.
But that's how dinosaurs and most fossils are named, though. But we really don't see anything changing from a dog to some other animal or into a dog.
Nothing changing into a dog, eh? So I guess animals like the amphicyonids, miacids, and Hesperocyon just never got found.
And we don't know where dinosaurs came from. There's a big debate of where did dinosaurs, if you're an evolutionist, where did they evolve from? Mm-hmm. We just see things showing up, suddenly fully formed.
Well then, I suppose Dr. Clary is unaware of the wider categories of Dinosauromorpha and Dinosauriformes, with animals like Silosuchus and Lagosuchus. Is this just going to be Tim Clary being wrong about the fossil record for a while? Probably yes. That being said, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you to like, share, and subscribe, because otherwise, this channel can't keep growing, and I would really like it to do that.
Completely, the long necks show up fully formed as long tails, long necks.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of weird that we're going with the naming conventions from the land before time, but okay, let's talk about sauropods, or more properly, the basal sauropodomorphs, like Thecodontosaurus, Saturnalia, or Chromegasaurus, which in fact don't have a neck or tail much longer than any other basal dinosaur. They in fact represent the exact thing Dr. Clary asked for, the beginning of sauropods with short necks. They're even bipeds. We could talk about animals like Plateosaurus, which have a longer neck and longer forelimbs, such that it was probably only sometimes a biped. Then we have animals like Ankylosaurus and Massospondylus, which are even further along in the journey to being a typical sauropod that we know and love. So in fact, we do have transitional fossils for the long necks, as Dr. Clary puts it.
The T-Rexes show up with their teeth and their short arms. They just show up as T-Rexes. There's no animals in the rocks below to show a transition to those animals.
There's no halfway point.
Yeah.
Wrong again. Tyrannosauroidea diverges in the mid-Jurassic and starts off being a fairly basal group of coelurosaurs, as you might expect. We have the three-fingered and long-armed Proceratosaurids like Proceratosaurus and Guanlong. Then there's the two-fingered and bigger-headed but still long-armed Dilong. There's Raptorex that shows the arms beginning to shorten, but which is still only about a meter tall. With Appalachiosaurus, we're starting to get big like Tyrannosaurus. Finally, we get to the more famous Tyrannosaurids, like Albertosaurus and Tyrannosaurus. But only after a long history of animals that became more and more specialized for these lifestyles that those last animals adopted.
And that's the way it is to all the rock records.
Well, since we saw lots of transitional fossils, then I guess the rock record is full of those. Cool.
The most amazing thing to me is and Darwin talked about this, is the Cambrian explosion.
I've heard of it, yes.
So we're doing the NPR voice now? Well now, back to Dr. Clary and that other guy telling us nonsense about fossils.
And that's where we believe that's some of the first rocks that started to flood the land, bringing in those marine fossils. And we see around the world, we see the initial flooding
And that's
events.
so evolutionists have a problem with the Cambrian explosion for
I mean, no, it's just the earliest radiation of macroscopic organisms with hard parts, so unlike earlier periods where everybody was soft and squishy for the most part, we have a better record of it.
from my understanding, it's where all of a sudden we have what we would consider complex life in the record, correct?
I don't know, I consider Namacalithus pretty complex, and that's from before the Cambrian.
Yes, even eyes. The trilobites, have these amazing compound eyes, which baffles the evolutionary world. How do you explain those?
Well, let's look at a paper about eye evolution, shall we? This is a pessimistic estimate of the time required for an eye to evolve by Dan Nilsson and Suzanne Pelger from Lund University in Sweden. Here's the summary they give. Theoretical considerations of the eye design allow us to find routes along which the optical structures of eyes may have evolved. If selection favors an increase in the amount of detectable spatial information, a light-sensitive patch of cells will gradually turn into a focused lens eye through continuous small improvements of design. An upper limit for the number of generations required for the complete transformation can be calculated with a minimum of assumptions. Even with a consistently pessimistic approach, the time required becomes amazingly short, only a few 100,000 years. The paper assumed that any generation could only modify what started as just a bit of light-sensitive tissue with only 1% in terms of shape, and found that even with the most unfavorable assumptions, if this selection pressure for visual acuity, then in well under a million years, you can go from something no more complicated than a black patch of cells, you can go from something no more complicated than a black patch that tells you if it's night or day, to a complex camera eye of capturing nearly aberration-free images. The paper is linked in the description, and at the time of my writing, this has over 500 citations. Trilobites show up about 520 million years ago, but the Cambrian started about 540 million years ago. So we have plenty of time for trilobites to start off as small, squishy, segmented things with no eyes, and then evolve them 40 times over. I don't think this is the big problem that Dr. Clary thinks it is.
Lately, the evolutionary community has been trying to downplay the Cambrian explosion, say, oh, it's not really an explosion.
I mean, it literally isn't. Nothing exploded. But it was a very rapid diversification of especially animals.
But it really is. I mean, even in their time scale, it's, they're saying, well, it took millions of years, but, for them, that's a blink in their eye.
The Cambrian is 55 million years long, and it came in multiple stages, with the first mollusks coming in about 535 million years ago, the first trilobites about 520 million years ago, and the first chordates, our own phylum, coming about 505 million years ago. There were mollusks for 30 million years before the first thing with a dorsal nerve cord, and for about 50 million years before the first trilobite ever looked out at the world. I don't know, but it seems to me like the accumulation of diversity in animals over the course of some 55 million years is the kind of thing evolution says should happen. Now, is 55 million years a lot of time geologically? No, it's really not. But is it more than sufficient to fit all the evolution apparent in the fossil record during that time? Oh yes, it's quite sufficient. In fact, no one in paleontology talks about a problem of the Cambrian explosion anymore, because it just isn't a problem.
And so it really is, suddenly there's all forms of life. Almost every animal phyla just shows up instantly all over the world in the Cambrian rocks.
Well, no, we just said it took tens of millions of years for them to all finally get there. And they didn't, in fact, all show up in the fossil record during the Cambrian. Bryozoa, which is a whole phylum on its own, doesn't show up until the Ordovician. But also, when he says all modern forms of life, he's intentionally making it seem like by the end of the Cambrian we had sharks and squid and elephants and lizards. We didn't. We had extremely basal members of various phyla which look very little like the modern members of those groups. Heck, even snails had to wait for the Ordovician as the earliest to show up. Although, as you might expect, if evolution were true, there were stem gastropods in the late Cambrian.
So it really is this explosion. And we explain that as flood geologists, as that's the first major advances of the seas as they start to flood the land.
Right.
Hey, about those snails. They today live in the kinds of environments we find in the Cambrian fossil assemblages. So, why aren't they in Cambrian rocks? For that matter, why are there no shrimp, no ray-finned fish, no sharks, no sea snakes, and no turtles? What's up with that? Were they just immune to tsunami numero uno? There are all these fossils that we should be seeing today, and no, the fact that there were jawless almost vertebrates, stem gastropods, and some basal mandibular arthropods doesn't answer this question. In fact, it only makes things seem more like the flood explanation pales in comparison to the scientific explanation.
It didn't flood everything. Again, there's a progressive flood. Boy, we start seeing these initial marine fossils. So, of course, you're going to see representatives of every major phyla because you're washing those, what's down in the ocean, and suddenly burying them on land in a bunch of sediment. So you see a complete ecosystem right off the bat.
Yeah, there are no Cambrian semi-arthropods like Hallucigenia, Opabinia, Anomalocaris, or Fuxianhuira in the Cambrian. Arthropods just pop into existence with no possible forms around them linking them to other phyla, like Onychophora or Tardigrada, or even other ecdysozoans like horsehair worms or penis worms. And certainly there are no arthropods like Scania that look like potential proto-trilobites.
And that's exactly below that. They've studied and studied and studied. They try to find it. The trilobite is a big critter that's found, an arthropod in the Cambrian.
Right.
And they look below that to try to find ancestors to those. And they have done concerted efforts looking, and they find nothing.
Oh yeah, there are no potential ancestors for trilobites in the Ediacaran, like Parvancorina, Sprigina, or Archaeospinus. All of those are fake. Am I claiming these are definitely the ancestors of trilobites? No, I am not. But to say that there are no animals before the Cambrian that could be candidates is just not true.
There's nothing like a trilobite in the rocks below. Below the Cambrian, which we think is the bottom rock layers mostly of the initial sequence that floods the land, that the sock sequence we call it.
Yeah, which, as we can see in Shark Bay, Australia, are the kind of thing you get in shallow water environments, since the algae are photosynthetic. So, how did they get buried so soon? But other shallow water organisms kept trucking all the way through since they were captured with the early rhinos and such? How does that work?
Below that, there's really nothing besides just a few, what could be earliest flood sediments in a few places called Ediacaran fossils. And then below that, it's mostly just algae, stromatolites and things that build up these algal-type mounds that built up almost like a bacteria.
Yeah, except we have porphyrians going back like 300 million years earlier than that. At some point, maybe Dr. Clary can say something that is actually true. That itself might be good evidence for God, because at this rate, it would be a miracle.
There's a little bit of what's called the Ediacaran, where we see some strange-looking animal-like things or maybe plant-like things. But they almost kind of look like plants, but I think they're technically animals.
So where did those animals live that it was devoid of any of the modern phyla? Dr. Clary's idea of a pre-flood world sure does seem bizarre.
And those are only in selected locations around the world, so we don't...
Yep, Pre-Cambrian fossil locations are pretty uncommon.
You've got little bits and pieces. It appears when the Cambrian came in, there was also a major erosional surface called the Great Unconformity, which is pretty much global as well.
I mean, the Great Unconformity is an erosion feature, that's true.
So there's a lot of erosion as these waves kind of work their way in as they start to flood the land. So you deposit all this animals of every type from the oceans, and you're also, below that, you have a big erosional surface. As the waves were coming in, they were eroding as they went. And so a lot of the Pre-Cambrian sediments were eroded away at that point as well. But there's still remnants of them. Some areas quite extensive.
So now I just want to point out that floods and tsunamis are very high-energy depositional environments. They are clearly distinct from low-energy deposition. And that's not just some uniformitarian assumption. That's straight-up physics and experiment saying that. So why do we see low-energy deposition evident in the rocks that are supposed to be from a flood? And not just a flood, a worldwide tsunami-inducing one.
Like in Africa, and even here in the United States, there's some locations where we can see Pre-Cambrian sediments near some of these rifts, like the mid-continent rift that runs through Lake Superior and down into Iowa. And you can still see in the flanks of those some of these fossil stromatolites and other Pre-Cambrian fossils.
Right.
Yep, there sure are Pre-Cambrian fossils. Not sure what the point is.
But again, it all begins with the flood really kicks into gear in the Cambrian.
Right.
And we see that universally. And that's where you see suddenly everything shows up. And again,
because he drowned.
And the question for the evolutionists is, how did we get from these little Ediacaran fossils, strange little things, or algae all of a sudden to all these animals like trilobites?
Mm-hmm.
Mutation and natural selection. I mean, what else does he need for the answer? It's plenty of time to evolve all these organisms. He hasn't in any way demonstrated that it's a problem for evolution. He just declared that it must be, and said without real reference that scientists also think it's a problem.
Where did they come from? And they can't find any. There's no answers.
Can't find any what? Answers? Fossils? Hypotheses? We have all three.
So the story of evolution that they see, marine animals becoming land animals and all these different things, is just a story. It doesn't really fit the rock record because we don't see those transitions between them.
Oh, right. We don't see animals like Eusthenopteron, Tiktaalik, and Acanthostega. I forgot. Those are made up.
And they have a handful they try to point to once in a while, but they all fall kind of through the cracks because other people dispute them in the evolutionary world even.
Right.
And so
There's no
unfortunately, we just see the order of burial in the flood.
I'm going to need a citation for scientists who aren't already anti-evolutionists, who think we don't have transitional stem tetrapods.
And occasionally we see these big extinctions that they call extinctions. They're not really extinctions. They're just a major shift.
And this is the guy who thinks that actual scientists simply make up just so stories. I think we got a nice case of projection here.
Some of those kind of line up even with the mega sequences we talked about in an earlier episode.
Right.
As the waves kind of come in and go, we see different animals and different plants are buried at different levels as the water progressed higher and higher.
Here's something fun. Real geologists don't use the term megasequence, so when you search for it, basically all that comes up is young Earth pseudoscience. Never forget, kids, the only difference between believing in a young Earth and a flat Earth is how long we've known you're wrong.
So those major changes, where you suddenly lose something, you completely inundate that environment, and you go to the next rocks above it, you see such a major difference.
Right.
They call that an extinction event. And so, like I think we talked about earlier, the dinosaurs all disappeared about the end of the Cretaceous.
Mm-hmm.
Well, except for those birds. And just to show you how amazing modern dinosaurs are, here's a pair of great tits, a European shag, and some boobies. I am convinced that birds were named by a 12-year-old boy.
And it's not coincidence. That's why they call it they changed the name Cretaceous to the next levels above it, because so many fossils disappear there.
Right.
So that it's kind of a circular reasoning to say that's an extinction event that happened there, because that's how they named those particular rock layers. They were based on the fossil changes.
Circular reasoning, huh? Let's double check this. So we notice a huge change in paleofauna at a particular identifiable point. Deduce that it's an extinction event, right or wrong, then name the rock layers based on the paleofauna, then name the extinction event after the names given to the rock layers. I'm not really sure I see the circularity there. Would Dr. Clary prefer that we had just divided the geologic column at random, rather than it being based on something observable in the rock? Because the thing is, even if he were right that the flood is the cause of all of this, it's still the case that the Cretaceous rocks have very different life than the Paleogene rocks above them. This would be a notable shift no matter how it happened. Why wouldn't we call those rocks different things?
Name the fossils from the rocks
right.
and the rocks
and
from
so,
the fossils.
So, all the fossil names like Cambrian, Ordovician, all those names came about because of changes in the fossils.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really just a record of the progressive flood. As you change different environments, you get different animals start showing up.
If that was supposed to tell me how that was circular, it sure didn't. Are humans just wrong for putting names on things based on their observable characteristics?
As the water got deeper and deeper onto the continents, you see that progressive change of fossils as well. So it matches what I'm seeing in the sediments. A progressive flood explains the fossil record just as well as it explains the progressive flood we see across the continents.
And the two kind of go hand in hand.
They go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And it's all described in the Bible.
Yeah.
You read Genesis 7, it's a progressive flood.
What verse talked about the stromatolites getting caught in a tsunami again? I don't remember that verse.
And so we get exactly what we'd expect to see. But the evolutionists have to come up with their own story. They want to push God out of the picture.
Right.
Meet Dr. Mary Schweitzer, a practicing evangelical Christian and a conventional paleontologist. You really going to tell me that she, a current Christian and former young Earth creationist, is trying to get rid of God? Or hey look, this is Dr. Joel Duff, another active Christian who sees his science advocacy as part of a Christian witness, and who is not only a conventional biologist, but one who likes to dunk on creationists because their false witness does a disservice to Christianity. Is he trying to get rid of God? I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this is not a fight between Christians and atheists. It's a crusade by pseudoscientist hucksters that is barely even noticed by most scientists, because it makes absolutely no impact on their jobs.
So they have developed their own story, and they throw in this deep time, millions and billions of years, which they need. They kind of need both pillars. They need slow progressive evolution, and to do that they need billions and millions of years.
Right.
And so they kind of have to have both those pillars of time and evolution going on.
Odd that deep time was discovered before evolution was. Also odd that deep time is as well accepted today as the sphericity of the Earth, the place of the sun at the center of the solar system, or universal gravitation. So is it just a vast conspiracy to stop people from believing in God? And it's so powerful that a large portion of the conspirators paradoxically believe in God?
That's awesome. I love your work. It's great to see, like, this is all such a new thing, right? It's no one's done this before.
No one has lied about paleontology before? I think you'll find that is not true. In some ways, my channel is just a testament to the fact that lots of people lie about paleontology.
It's kind of refreshing in that regard, because it really is showing what the Bible has told us all along.
Yeah.
We're just filling in some of the details, some of the little bit of wisdom that God's allowing us to see of what happened during the flood year. He gives us major dates, like how the flood begins, day 40, the ark is floating, so you're flooding the land, and then day 150 seems to be the high point, and we can match that up to the geology and the fossils as well.
Yeah.
And they all kind of show a similar pattern.
I would love to see the chart of which rocks were deposited on which days of the flood. And here's something fun. Dr. Clary and Dr. Snelling are in a bit of a dispute. You see, Dr. Clary says that nearly all of the Cenozoic rock is flood rock, whereas Dr. Snelling says that the flood ends at the end of the Cretaceous. And both make excellent arguments about why the other is wrong. And you know why they can both make such excellent arguments? Because they're both wrong. It's impossible to draw a flood boundary because there was no global flood.
And I believe humans are probably living at the highest elevations in the pre-flood world.
Makes sense.
No, it doesn't make sense. High elevations are relatively resource poor compared to the coasts. That's why in 2007, the United Nations reported that some 40% of the human population lives within 100 kilometers or 62 miles of the coast. Archaeology also supports the idea that many of our oldest cities and settlements were low elevation. Mountains are relatively sparsely inhabited. In fact, occupied Tibet has a population density of 3 persons per square kilometer on average. On average for the occupying power, mainland China has 147 persons per square mile. And within that country, the population density is a gradient getting higher towards the coast. Nothing about humans being a highland population before the flood makes sense. It's counter to everything we know about where humans choose to live in the real world. The only real exceptions to this are India, which is basically wall-to-wall high population density, and places where the coast is inhospitable due to being too dry, too cold, or both.
Many of the common mammals, horses and lions and tigers and bears.
Oh my.
Yes. And you don't find those with dinosaurs. And
Right.
so I think they're at higher elevations, and the plants are different at higher elevations, more of the common flowering plants we see. Whereas dinosaurs at a little lower elevation would live in more swamp areas.
Oh, so mammals lived in upland grasslands, and dinosaurs in lowland swamps. Okay, so why are Velociraptor and Protoceratops found in Mongolian deserts? Why are there mammal fossils in marine deposits? See, this just doesn't work, and all it takes is a cursory understanding of the fossil record. I'm no expert, just a reasonably well-informed layperson, but this wouldn't pass the sniff test in any peer-reviewed paleontology venue.
And they're different plants, not more the ferns and the non-flowering plants. And so the evolutionists, of course, interpret that as plants evolved as well.
Right.
But really it's just just an elevation levels where plants are living at different elevations, just like the animals were.
So the kinds of plants that dinosaurs were eating, like pine trees, ferns, cycads, horsetails, and club moss, are still around. But so are the flowering plants. We know that in almost all niches, flower plants outcompete non-flowering plants at all elevations. So what was so special about before the flood that made this not the case?
Right.
And so we don't really find a lot of certain animals with dinosaurs, but we do find squirrels with dinosaurs, squirrel-like animals, beaver-like animals, things that lived in the swamps. There are mammals that lived in these swamps. They're just not horses and camels.
But there are also not really beavers and squirrels. There are mammal relatives and a few actual mammals in groups that aren't around anymore. Why are those mammals not still thriving in swamps today? What made them get displaced by their upland true mammal competitors?
No need for
Rhinos.
millions of years.
There's none of that.
Yeah.
When you look at the truth of God's word, and you look at the rock record, and you look at the fossil record, and you look at they actually match. You see a progressive flood starting in the marine realm, working your way up to the land animals, starting with the swampy areas, but they're also mixing those with marine, as I mentioned, T-Rexes with marine animals, and that's universal around the world.
Funny how the only people that reach that conclusion start with that conclusion.
And then you go higher, you see the mammals. Most of the mammals were deposited as the water was receding because it went over the top and kind of washed them back down.
I'm going to need to see how that conclusion was reached.
So there's probably a lot of mammal fossils even offshore, just like that dinosaur I mentioned earlier as well. But to me, the evolutionary community has not adequately explained why these animals, not just in the Cambrian, but throughout the rock record, everything shows up fully formed, ready to go.
Well, I don't know what a half-formed animal would be, but as we've seen, we have plenty of transitional forms. But this is where I'm going to call it. After this, he just repeats his conclusions from earlier, and then goes into how maybe Behemoth is a dinosaur, or fossils don't form today. It's nonsense, but it's nonsense I've covered ad nauseum. That means that we're done with Dr. Clary for now. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, remember to hit like and leave a comment. Or if you didn't, hit dislike and tell me in the comments why not. Either way, please do subscribe and turn on all notifications so you're always notified when I have more content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Bent Hovend, Cynically Skeptic, Denny5252, Ian Chen, John Ackerman, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, McSpooks, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Veed, and Patrick Dennis. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. But the people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if an annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.
How